Hello there. Welcome to the Africa Rights Talk podcast, a Center for Human Rights podcast series exploring a range of human rights issues through conversations with academics, practitioners, and activists. I am your host, Victoria Amechi. Let's dive in. Hi, I'm Victoria. I'm from the Center for Human Rights. Welcome to Africa Rights Talk podcast. My guest here for episode 11 is Chitra.
It's Chitra Nagarajan.
Chitra Nagarajan. Okay. Welcome, Chitra. Thank you for gracing this podcast with your voice and your time. And before we waste any further time, let me ask you, what is it that you do?
Thank you very much, Victoria. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. So I work broadly on issues of conflict, human rights, and peace building. And I've been doing this work for about 15 years, mostly in West Africa, but also a little bit in other parts of the world. And I've been working in Northeast Nigeria and the broader Lake Chad Basin region for over 10 years now, since 2012, 2013. And for me, I really came at writing from the perspective of an activist to get certain perspectives and analyses out in the general domain that are not there at the moment. And in terms of this book, The World Was in Our Hands, and also the previous book that I worked on, She Called Me Woman, which is about queer women in Nigeria's stories. The aim really was to document what is going on for the people of concerned. So in this case, the people affected by the conflict in the Lake Chad Basin region, for other people to know what's going on. Boko Haram used to be something that was very much in the news in Nigeria and internationally. That's no more the case now. But of course, people are still living with conflicts. And also to contribute to the archive of the future and what is known about the current situation in years to come. Because what we find is that often history becomes the stories of the elite or the victors, and the voices of people who are not from those categories can get lost. And we see not only that they get lost, but there's a conscious erasure of, for example, women's realities, the realities of queer people, of poor people, of those who resisted oppression. And that's also one of the reasons that I really wanted to document what was happening now, not just for us, but also for future generations.
Thank you so much for that, Chitra. I really do resonate with that insight. You talked about the Chibok girls. I mean, I think it was 10 years ago. Yeah, 10 years ago since this happened, and it's been quiet ever since. And you thought that it was important to bring the stories to life. I mean, not to be forgotten, basically. Why specifically on the victim survivor account, basically?
I mean, first of all, I would like to say that there's been a lot of really excellent reporting and excellent books out there about the conflict and what's happening. And I can really understand why the media would focus on these spectacular stories or the day-to-day, kinetic military details and massacres. 2,000 people killed in this one location. The Nigerian army recovers so-and-so place, because that's the job of the media, right? However, this focus on military attacks and successes and the focus on the spectacular really just leaves out so much of what is going on, which is really important to bring to attention, to know the reality of lives for people living through this conflict. And I think for me as well, it's, you talked about survivors, and yes, of course, everybody in the region has been affected by conflict to some extent. So they're all survivors. But also, I think one of the things that I wanted to do in the book is to break down these categories of victims, survivors, perpetrators, and people who have agency, because actually what we find is that one person can be all three. So they can perpetrate violence, but they can also be the victims of violence and bring about change as well. And the book is full of stories of people, of individuals who have done that. So yes, I think that's also really important as well, because I think as far as I can see, the writing that's there at the moment, it really misses that, the perspective of what it means to live through such a conflict, and how often people are put in situations not of their making and need to try to best figure out how to navigate the dynamics around them to keep themselves and their families and the wider communities safe. And sometimes that leads to choices that perhaps it's difficult to understand until you look at the situation from people's perspectives. And I think that that's one of the reasons why so many people join groups that engage in violence. Of course, that's a whole bigger conversation, and there are many, many factors. But yeah, I think it's important to really try and understand matters from people's own perspectives, even if those people are not people with whom we would necessarily agree with.
Thank you so much for that. I do agree with that, what you just said. It speaks to the fact that how some of these elements of maybe patriarchy, corruption, violence, basically all interact to give authentic accounts of these people in your book. And how do you think these dimensions of characters give an authentic mapping out of the conflict of Boko Haram?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think one of the things that the narratives in the book does, actually, you talked about patriarchy. And often when we think of conflict, we have quite simplistic and binary ideas of men as perpetrators and women as victims and survivors, maybe peace builders, whereas the men are the ones who perpetrate violence and also negotiate peace. And one of the things that the narratives do when you read them all together is really break down this binary and show men's victimhood and vulnerability, and also the wide array of things that women do in conflict, including, of course, be victimized, but also be agents and be perpetrators as well, and everything in between. And in fact, in some ways, the book also just breaks down this gender binary in general, because we have a narrative who is intersex, and she has a very interesting story. We have narratives who don't fall within the gender binary. And I think that's also really important, especially because I think we have this idea of where queerness is in the region. And often we think that it's something that is in the cities and amongst the elite, but we know that there are queer people everywhere in every strata of society, including in communities that are affected by conflict and violence, and across all socioeconomic classes. So yes, I think that's important as well. And just on these kind of gendered experiences of conflict, of course, people of all genders experience all forms of harms. But what we have seen in the region is that, broadly speaking, men have been viewed, because of patriarchal norms and the way that we see the world through gendered lenses, men have been viewed as combatants or potential combatants, and therefore both forcibly recruited and forced to fight by armed groups, and also seen as, quote unquote, the enemy, and targeted for arbitrary detention, extrajudicial killing, and other things by the security forces of the region. Because of that, in a lot of communities, when things looked like they would get dangerous, a lot of men and older boys left the place, leaving behind women, elderly people, and children. So one of the things that comes out clearly from the narrative in the book is really breaking this idea of men as perpetrators and women as victims, and showing the full range of human experience during the conflict, including the vulnerability of men and the agency and perpetration of women. And this meant actually that the burden fell on women's shoulders of trying to negotiate with people with guns, whether it was the military or the armed opposition group or anybody else, and try to navigate ways to safety for themselves and their family members. And I think that that is an aspect of the conflict that hasn't really been reflected in popular discourse at present, but is really important to understanding what's going on. And the book contains several narratives of women who saved men from harm. So one woman in particular, she talks about how the women in her community, and it wasn't just her community, it was also other communities, because they knew that people who were parts of Boko Haram were going house to house, taking out all the men and older boys and killing them. She and the other women of the community hid men in their homes. So she herself saved 16 men. She hid them in her house. She sewed himar for them, dressed them up so that they looked like women, and then walked with them to safety while being 7 months pregnant. There's another woman whose husband was captured, and she worried that they would kill him. And so she actually left her brother's house where she was safe to go into Sambisa forest to rescue her husband. And when she got there, she found out that he had been injured and couldn't walk. And so after a few months of trying to figure out what to do, she put him in a wheelbarrow and wheeled him for many, many hours over rough terrain in the bush to safety in order to rescue her husband. Also women who chose to join the group to try and rescue and free their children, their brothers, etc. I think this aspect is something that isn't really known and discussed when it comes to the conflict, but is really crucial for us to understand what is going on, but also really kind of cuts against any preconceptions or stereotypes we might have about women, and especially women who have not had the access to education, who are from poor communities. I think there is this idea of what such a woman is like and what she experiences in conflict, but the reality as represented by the narratives of the book really explodes all those myths and stereotypes.
Thank you so much for that. The last, let me say, couple of years now, there's been a lot of research going on in Nigeria regarding climate change, and had a couple of perspectives or voices in the book regarding how climate change intersects with conflicts. Why do you think it was important to have that perspective?
Climate change is something that we've been talking about in Nigeria for a while. It's become really pressing, as in the rest of the world, because of the way that the climate is changing in the country, and the impacts that's having on people in terms of their health, in terms of their access to resources, but also when it comes to conflicts in the country, and not just in Nigeria, but other parts of West Africa as well. And the book really is a showcase for the realities of people living through the conflict. And so it talks about the conflict, of course, but it also talks about other issues as well, which are important to people's lives. And so that includes things like climate change, but also it includes the realities of what it means to be living in the Lake Chad Basin region. And for that, climate change has been so such an important factor, because of the way that it has affected the livelihoods of many people in the region. And of course, this would have been there anyway, as it is in other parts of the region. But also it's particularly salient because of the way that climate change and conflict have been mapping on to each other. So people had experienced changes in the climate, changes in the seasons, for many years before the conflict, and they were able to adapt to that. They diversified their livelihoods, they migrated to new places, a seasonal migration, but also migrating and staying there. They planted new types of crops, they fished in new places. There was a lot of ways that people could adapt to the changing climate. However, what's happened is because of the conflict, many of those adaptation strategies are no longer available to people. So it's not possible to move because it's not safe. Many of the places that were fertile are no longer safe. They're no-go areas, so people can't go there. And the areas that are both safe and fertile are very small in number comparatively, and have large population densities. So people don't have enough land to be able to farm, especially people who are displaced or people who are returning from the bush, who were part of Boko Haram and coming back. And so that's really made lives very difficult for people, because I would say that, broadly speaking, there are two main things that people want in the region. The first is security, and the second is decent, sustainable livelihoods. And so, of course, there has been a huge humanitarian effort to support people, and people are very grateful for that. But, people don't want to be there dependent on humanitarian assistance that may or may not come. They want to be self-sufficient and provide for themselves and their families as they used to do before. And climate change and conflict are two of the factors that work and combine together to make it very difficult for people to pick up the pieces of their lives and restart their livelihoods. And so that's the reason that you see this climate change narrative coming out very strongly in the stories that are in the book. Also, the narratives were very influenced by the work that I was doing in the 5 years that I was, that the narratives span, the 5 years of interviews that I did that informed the book. And one of the things that I was focusing on during that time was precisely the impacts of climate change and how that's interacting with conflict.
Thank you so much, Chitra, for that. I do agree. And the center as a body has been interested with a lot of climate change advocacy. Your book humanizes the conflict in Nigeria. In looking at the Palestine-Israeli war and the case of the Ukraine-Russia war, I'm yet, maybe I don't read a lot, but I'm yet to see a book of such nature being published about the voices of actual survivors, and also given that multi-layered characterization of the voices. And you use publishing of such books in those areas, in Russia or Ukraine, could bring about the same aim or position regarding conflicts in those regions as you have done in the case of Boko Haram.
I mean, I do think it's important to document people's realities, and I'm a big believer in the power of storytelling. I mean, there have been attempts in the past to document people's realities in Eastern Europe. So, for example, if you look at, I'm trying to remember the name of the book, by Svetlana Alexievich, who wrote, I think, The Womanly Face of War is her book, where she talks about the experiences of women who fought during in the Soviet Union, who fought in the Second World War. And that was very influential in terms of bringing those realities to light. And there have been other books as well that have looked at the human impact of war through storytelling. And I do think that's important. However, at saying that, at the same time, I think we need to be a bit mindful about what the potential impacts of this kind of work are and realistic. I have been very struck recently by the decision of an Instagram account, which had been, since the 7th of October, been profiling the lives and realities of people who had been killed by Israel's bombardment of Gaza. And so they would give a photo and a description of each person to try and make the point that these were human beings who were killed in genocide. And recently they made the decision to stop doing that because, in their own words, like what the last few months have shown us, is that trying to humanize people in this way in order to build opposition for war and genocide doesn't work at the political level. So yes, it's very important, I think, because such things can affect what is known by the wider society and can build pressure on politicians to change. But also the political will needs to be there to, in this case, bring about an end to conflict and genocide. And yes, people's stories is one tool, but it's not the only tool. There's a lot of other things that are needed in terms of mass mobilization.
I do agree about the importance of actual personal accounts regarding wars across the globe, because that's how we can actually fundamentally understand the plight of people, because sometimes the media sometimes can do a disservice or some injustices regarding the effects and the magnitude of such wars. And sometimes because of the lack of personal accounts, sometimes these wars end up taking longer than necessary to reach some form of a deal to end it. So yeah, thank you for that response. I saw that you were being careful with the play on homosexuality in this book and the voices. I think you said, I believe I look out for very non-popular perspectives to Nigerian stories, such as queer perspectives. In the lines of, if you're not doing homosexuality, or if homosexuality is covered and you're found on news spreads, and where I think they were trying to tie wrath of God to the homosexuality or the lesbianism, or and you kind of in a brief part of one of the stories, I saw that they tried to instill ideology that this conflict may have stemmed from these girls, or this unfortunate girls who may have been dabbled in lesbianism or some homosexuality in a very conservative Islamic region and culture. Why do you think it was necessary to have that kind of where you threw in some homosexuality, some queer perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, going back to what I said earlier, my aim with this book was really to document what the reality of life in the Lake Chad region is in terms of people who've been affected by conflict. And so I tried to have as diverse a range of voices as possible, with a focus on people who are socially excluded and marginalized. And that's the reason why I have a significant number of people with disabilities, for example, people of Christian, Muslim religious backgrounds, but also followers of indigenous religions, which is the category of people whose voices and perspectives are often not present in public narratives about the conflict. to have people who had taken part in the fighting and been part of what others would term terrorist groups, and also queer people, because queer people are there. I think of all the people who I mentioned just now, queer people are the people whose perspectives are completely absent. In media reporting, in public discussion and discourse, but they exist in the Lake Chad region. They are affected by conflict in the same ways as everybody else, and they're affected by the conflict and violence in other ways as well. And it would have been an incomplete collection of stories, of narratives, without having their realities in it too. So that's one reason, just to make sure that it is as kind of complete a perspective as possible. I mean, of course, it's impossible to be completely representative, but you can try to be as diverse and representative as possible. The second reason is really looking at what happens in terms of the erasure of certain voices and histories from the record, and queer people's lives often are not in the historical record, which is important in and of itself, and also because how that affects future generations. So if there had been a book like this, which included queer people's narratives, or a book like She Called Me Woman, Nigeria's Queer Women Speak, which is the book that Kasara Republic Press published back in 2018, which I and a couple of friends worked on. If such books had been published 50 years ago or 100 years ago, do you think that people would so easily have been able to say, which they do all the time, that homosexuality is not part of our tradition, not part of our culture, not part of our practices? No, they wouldn't. Or they would find it much more difficult to say that, or they'd have to come up with another narrative. But this narrative that homosexuality or gender fluidity is un-Nigerian, un-Chadian, un-Cameroonian, un-Nigerian is so pervasive and so harmful to the lives of queer people, that it's really important to show not only that queer people exist, but that they experience everything that other people experience, for people today, but also for future generations, so that these kinds of narratives, we hope, would find it more difficult to gain traction in the future. And it's been very interesting. Some of the responses to She Called Me Woman when it came out was, we didn't realize that these people existed in Nigeria. They are just like us. They're also struggling with the corruption, with trying to find a job, with paying school fees and other things. So that, I think, is very important and very powerful. And, I say in the introduction that I wanted to document the conflict from multiple and diverse perspectives, and that the reader might find certain narratives challenging. So, I mean, I know myself, I found some narratives challenging and problematic. So reading the account of someone who perpetrated violence or supported others to do so, people who kidnapped girls, people who killed others, it is difficult. And for other readers, because my primary audience is the people of the region, like I'm not writing for a white or a Western audience. So for some of the readers of the book, they might find it also difficult to read about people who have sexual orientations or gender identities that they themselves consider deviant. And and I understand that. And maybe it's a bit strange for me to put those two together. But saying that, there's a lot more discussion on how to reintegrate people who took part in violence and reduce levels of stigma against them, as opposed to the complete silence that there is around queerness. So I think also, I hope that people, as they read, that it can contribute to humanizing people, queer people who are seen as very dehumanized or as not existing, and start to change, at least to a small extent, the minds of some of the readers of the book.
Thank you for that. I really do agree on approaching everything with uncomfortability with the storytelling, because these are actual real life experiences. And most times people like to be in denial because they're uncomfortable. And I'm very happy about the authenticity of the storytelling. Thank you for humanizing the stories of these people, because it seems like 10 years ago, it was a very important issue in the media. I mean, everyone in the world was rallying behind these girls. And it seems it's gone quiet. And I feel like you bringing back this storytelling, this publication of this book, just right in time, 10 years of the violence, is it's very thoughtful. You know, the situation of conflict in Nigeria and other parts of the world, and how this really affects the daily lives of real lives of people. Based on this agency that you've given us as survivors, your experience as a human rights activist and a journalist, you've understood the importance of storytelling, changing the world structure. Do you think the stories that you've highlighted can have that impact?
Yeah, I very much hope so. I hope that, even in Chad or Nigeria, or Niger or Cameroon, there's so much happening in each of those countries that even in those countries, kind of the conflict with Boko Haram has kind of lost a bit of salience. It's not really what people think about, because there's so much happening in each of these countries. Politically, economically, in terms of insecurity. So it does feel like it's a conflict that has been lost a little bit in the public and the political discourse. So I really hope with this book to make the point that this conflict is still going on, even in areas where it's safer now. People are still living with the legacies of the violence that they experienced, and they need support.
Thank you for that. Thank you overall for agreeing to join this discussion, this podcast discussion. And I really do hope that, like you said in the last comment, that these stories do make an impactful change and kind of like give a sense to the government and to the world that these are real lives of people that have been affected by this conflict, and also like legacies of conflicts. We come to the end of Africa Rights Talk podcast. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you. Pleasure talking with you, Victoria.
Same. Thank you. Bye.
You have just listened to the Africa Rights Talk podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Do not forget to subscribe to our YouTube channels, social media platforms such as Twitter and Instagram. Thank you for listening.